Hi, I'm Ken Boa, and I'm with Reflections Ministries, and this is the Reflections Podcast. And I'm with my associate, Stuart McAllister.
Good morning, Ken. How are you?
Doing exceedingly well, better than I deserve, as people often are wont to say.
Well, Ken, as we were driving around, it's that season of the year where we start seeing some of these ghoulish characters appearing on doorsteps, and people are getting ready for Halloween and all kinds of things. Kind of strange season of the year, right?
Well, it's changed as well over the years because it's becoming more and more of an emphasis as well. I think Halloween now really rivals Christmas in ways that I had not seen in the past. It's becoming a greater effort in my neighborhood as well. I'm noticing a lot more intensity of decoration for this than any other event.
You know, with that in mind, rumor has it that one of our colleagues, this Dr. Glenn Sunshine, um, he seems to have a strange curiosity about
I
vampires of
have
all
heard of
things.
this man, and he has a penchant. He has a penchant for the bizarre, the outre, the strange, the mysterious, and the preternatural. And so he does,
Well,
and he knows a lot about it as well.
I bet not only we would be interested in finding out more about these vampires and so forth, but to hear from the man himself. Why does he think these things? What is the fascination? I mean, goodness, should we even be talking about such things? Let's have a discussion about vampires. Isn't Glenn
Yeah,
on
I
hand
think
to have a
Glenn may
conversation?
well be on hand.
Dr. Sunshine,
Yeah,
are you
Dr.
around?
Sunshine, are you with us? I believe you are.
I I am certainly with you.
And you have
Yeah.
explored as a historian so many wonderful things, but you have really animated your classes with the strange things about vampires, but also ghouls and werewolves and the whole area of the plague. You really do a lot of wonderful things with things. And I think people get drawn into it because it's mysterious and strange and attractive in that strange way.
Tell us about it, Glenn. Where does this come from?
Well, I think a lot of it comes from the fact that my grandfather had me reading Edgar Allan Poe when I was 8. But when I got to the university, I quickly discovered that you need a sort of persona as a professor, and it turns out I'm really really good at plague. So I I'm really good at plague. And actually, I became kind of known on campus for my plague lectures.
Well,
Huh.
how did you get to vampires from the plague?
Okay, well, actually, there's a connection between the two, which we'll get into in a bit. But what ended up happening actually is I started teaching a course called Witches, Werewolves, and Vampires. It was really about superstition and popular religion, and it gave me an excuse to get the students thinking about some big worldview questions.
In this age of like scientism or scientific thought or so forth, are people interested, genuinely interested in these things? Was that a point you got real traction with students?
A lot of the course is packed out.
Wow.
Mhm.
And the interesting thing that I found is that they aren't as much into scientism as they used to be. The last time, it was either the last time or second to the last time I taught the course, I had students saying in class, yeah, I had the equivalent of a witch. I don't remember whether he called it that, who cast a curse on him. And he had to go to a woman who lived in his apartment complex who knew about these things, who lifted the curse. And he was dead serious. I don't think the current age of college students that we've got right now, I don't think they're as materialistic as they used to be. I think they've got a very strong belief in, or at least curiosity about the supernatural.
Well, tell us more about vampires. Where do they come from?
Okay, now the whole vampire thing. Well, where I started with it in my courses is with a woman named Mercy Lena Brown. Mercy died in 892 and is buried in Exeter, Rhode Island. Before she died, her mother and her older sister contracted a wasting disease. They died. Then Mercy and her brother contracted the disease, and Mercy died. They began to suspect that one of the dead people in the family, was coming back and basically sucking the life force out of the remaining members of the family.
Wow.
So they exhumed the bodies, and her mother and her older sister were appropriately decayed. But Mercy was found with blood in her blood in her internal organs, I believe the liver and the heart, and she was completely undecayed. So they said, she's the vampire. So what they did is they ended up cutting out her heart and her liver. They burned them and then mixed the ashes with liquid, probably just water, and had her brother drink them. Because this was, it turns out, a Romanian belief for how you protect against a vampire.
I see. So, but
Her
what was
brother
the
died
year?
2 months later.
What was the year
Anyway,
of this event?
but
What was the year of that event?
1892. 1892.
So,
Okay,
Glenn,
okay.
was the
Pretty
vampirology,
recent.
if that's the word?
It's pretty recent vintage.
Yeah, because that does seem recent, but the vampires had been around, or the idea of vampires had been around. Are they all, is this an imported from Europe concept?
Yes, it is. As it turns out, there were a number of vampire scares in New England, dating back into the 1700s. This is a recurring thought that keeps coming back. And the question is where it came from. Now, the idea of burning the internal organs and feeding them to family members is clearly Romanian. But the best guess is that vampire beliefs came into the New World, and particularly in New England, either from German Hessian mercenaries from King George III, who ended up staying here, or from German sailors on ships who brought the belief with them. Vampire beliefs, now you'll notice with all of this, I haven't said anything about drinking blood, because vampire beliefs don't actually start there. Vampire beliefs really start with a way of understanding disease, particularly initially plague, but then later wasting diseases like tuberculosis. And then there are several others in between. When these things happen, what we see is people assuming that someone who is dead, either in the family or in the community, is coming back and, well, killing people by taking their life force or something like that from them, usually at night while they sleep.
Kidda, is it intriguing though, isn't it, where these things come from in the human narrative? I mean, why do we project, or why do we create these, or where do these things come from in terms of our human interaction with life and evil or death and so forth?
I mean, you often see as well, even in the natural world, vampire bats and things, there are precedents that people would have been aware of. It seems that there would be pagan or primitive or ancient traditions that would be associated with some kind of dynamic of necromancy, but I'm not sure.
So tell us more.
Well,
We're intrigued.
actually, the first reference to vampires drinking blood apparently comes from something called the Country Journal, or the Craftsman, which was an English journal that came out regularly. 1732 is the first time that vampires are associated with drinking blood.
That's the first time.
Huh.
But there were beliefs about vampires that predate this. In the 17th century, dating no later than 1679, there was a concept that was common in Germany and actually extended down into Italy of what was called a Nachzehrer. These sometimes referred to as the chewing dead. The idea is that people who are dead and buried could somehow have this sort of semi-life undead kind of thing, and they would come out somehow come out of the ground and attack the living, inflicting plague and things like that. And when they suspected this, what they would do is they would start exhuming corpses to figure out which one was responsible for this. And what they would find would be things like a body would be there and the shroud would be in the mouth of the corpse, infrequently with a hole in it where it's in the mouth. And they said, this thing is one of the chewing dead. It is chewing it through the shroud.
Oh, now, Glenn, I have to interrupt you here because, these chewing shrouds, and my introduction in Scotland to vampires was not in this format at all. It was rather through a black and white movie where Bela Lugosi played the original vampire. And it was those creepy sort of Tyrolean visions of Count Dracula coming into the bedroom of some poor little woman who is visiting for the weekend or whatever and ends up with a man chewing her neck. Where did the more modern or these pictures begin? And of course, we went on to Christopher Lee and the Hammer versions in Britain.
Word.
These were all blood-soaked pictures of yes. Where did that more modern sort of vampirology or the writing of this, the romanticization of it, when did that start?
Okay, so what you have happening, let me just finish one final statement about the Knox error. When they believed that they found these, to prevent them from coming out, they would do something like stick a brick in between their teeth so that they couldn't chew anymore. And that the assumption was then that they wouldn't be able to come back. And you actually, just a month ago, I found an article about another vampire grave that was found, and it was found in this way. Archaeologists were working in a cemetery and they found a skeleton with a stone in its mouth, to prevent it from chewing. So this is not unusual. And when you see reports about vampire graves, that's typically what they're talking about. Now, how we get to the modern vampire, it goes through several phases. You've got initially these Knox errors, and then as you're moving through the 18th century, diseases that come up. There are actually several specific people that are associated with this. Diseases that come up and things like that are identified as being the responsibility of some form of undead. Then you get, in 1732, the Country Journal that adds blood-sucking to it. But things really start exploding in the 19th century, when science is the big thing. Modern science is developing and we're looking for scientific explanations for everything. There's sort of a counter reaction to this where, while the intellectual elites and so on are heading into science, on a popular level, there's this explosion of interest in vampires. And to put this in perspective, we have, let me find the authors. We've got, of course, Lord Byron, who had a couple of things on this, a guy named Polidori. Then eventually we start getting operas written about vampires, short stories and novels, theaters. In fact, it was said there's not a theater in Paris that did not have its vampire.
Wow.
Authors such as Gogol, Dumas the Elder, and Alexei Tolstoy are writing vampire stories, and so on. And all of this is coming out right in the period where modern science is emerging as supposedly the great intellectual trend. There's a counter trend.
So there's often that whole idea in a particular intellectual climate, and when you move into a more materialistic state and an account of things through a Darwinian vision of how things are ultimately brought into being, there seems to be a counter force that seeks to find something in the more mysterious and the less the upper story, as it were. Instead of when the lower story gets of materialism becomes so empty, there's a desire for something in a more transcendent or mysterious kind of way. Is that how you're seeing this? Is it kind of a concurrent reaction?
Yeah, I think so. The problem is that there are a lot of things that science can't really answer. And, questions about what happens after death. issues of meaning, purpose, all of these kinds of things. And it's not surprising to me that when you begin getting more materialistic explanations of the universe, that you get a counter reaction where you also see simultaneously a burst of superstition. And that's what we see here. The Bela Lugosi Dracula is really based on Bram Stoker. Stoker creates the modern concept of the vampire in a lot of ways. He took stories like Mercy Lena Brown that I mentioned earlier from New England. He was aware of that. He was aware of these reports. He was aware of the folklore. He was aware of the popular craze about vampires that was taking place. And he synthesized this to create Dracula. Now, interestingly enough, initially it was going to be Count Vampire was going to be the name. But he read a book about Transylvania and found out about the historic Dracula and said, Vlad Dracul, and said that, this is somebody that I can use. And so he changed the name, fortunately, from Lord Vampire to Count Dracula.
Sort of Vlad the Impaler.
Right. Who is himself a whole nother subject.
Glenn, can I don't want to stop you giving us the history here, but I'm just intrigued a little bit because of the appeal. I'm very interested, as you are, with the history of modernity. And a friend of mine years ago and I, the two of us were talking about this, and we saw at the heart of the modern world this idea of rational men and women in control of their destiny, the idea of reason as king and rationality and science and technology building the brave new world. But the romantic backlash, and as you were saying this, I was thinking of this irrational beings affecting destiny. So this almost like the Jungian idea, the dark side of life, that people want to have this order, quaint life, but they know that there is darkness. They know that there are forces of evil. They know that there's something sinister. There's an irrationality to existence that makes us uncomfortable. Do the vampires and such like serve then as a kind of a way to romanticize or picture evil without having giving us an escape mechanism? Or is it itself, is it an explanatory model? What is it?
Well, I think let's take a look at Dracula for a moment. One of the ways that you can analyze what's going on in Dracula is a battle between the modern scientific world on the one hand and the world of tradition, mystery, and supernatural on the other. It's a contest between the two of them. That's fundamentally what's going on in the book, if you're looking at it at sort of a philosophical level. And what you find is in Bram Stoker's vision, the scientific has no means of dealing with the ancient and traditional. When a monster arises out of this traditional past, this historic, mysterious, otherworldly past, modern science has no real way of dealing with it. And you have to go back to the ancient and the traditional to defeat it. Dracula gets shot. It doesn't affect him. The only way of doing this is putting a stake through his heart, which, by the way, connects in with earlier practices when they found bodies that without going into all of the gory details, and they do get gory, when they found a body that had been buried that doesn't seem to have decayed, that was looking sort of plump and red and healthy and all of that kind of thing, which has to do with some peculiarities of the way decay can occur, they would drive a stake through its heart. And when they did this, it frequently emitted sounds, which are described as screams and things like that. Well, it turns out that what's probably happening is the body is bloated because of decomposition, and there's gas buildup in it. And when you drive the stake through the heart, you hear the sound of the air escaping. But in any event, that's sort of the medical thing that's going on. But what this did to people is it validated the reality of vampires, and then Stoker picks up on it and runs with it.
Yeah. So it's a novel he put together, an epistolary novel, 1897. It's an intriguing thing. So really wasn't meant that many years later when your pal comes into being. So we have this whole the Count Dracula and all the imagery that we now associate with that, which is fascinating. But there's an earlier film that we were talking about, Glenn. It was by F.W. Murnau, 1922, Vampire, the Nosferatu, the vampire. And so it's an intriguing thing because that was associated, as you mentioned, with a plague. And so the concept of associating that with the plague, and then later on in 1997, I think Klaus Kinski plays the Nosferatu in a more sympathetic edition by a film by Werner Herzog. But the point is, they both bring us down to this idea of something sinister being introduced because of the Black Plague, and everyone comes in, and they're in the port, the city, the ship is empty of all life. It's an intriguing notion.
Yeah, and again, initially, remember the original version of this, you don't have them going around draining people's blood.
Yeah.
You have them operating on a, well, call it a more spiritual level, taking away their life force, leading them to, well, plague initially, but then other kinds of sudden unexpected deaths and eventually tuberculosis.
But there's also,
these are all associated with vampirism.
there seems to be an evolution within the story, Glenn. Is this right? Because I noticed, again, even I was making a joke about my Scottish introduction to Bela Lugosi, and then later on to Christopher Plummer and the vampire, and then the more modern ones, which are quite scary. But I noticed then when the whole romanticization, again, of now that you have love affairs with vampires, and then, but some of the earlier methodologies, whenever a cross or crucifix showed up, Christopher Lee would turn away or he'd get burned. Now the crosses and crucifix are basically, they laugh at them. They do nothing to them at all. So they've become romantic. We see them as eternal love pictures. What's happened now in the evolutionary development of the vampire in the postmodern world?
Yeah, well, what you see initially, like I said, is vampires are associated very much with fear of death, okay, with plague and so on. When you're getting into the 19th century, I would argue that they really represent in many ways the tension between tradition and modernity. As you're moving later, particularly Bram Stoker isn't the first person to do this, but with Bram Stoker, you begin getting a kind of romantic or eroticized version of the vampire, which begins to, not in Nosferatu certainly, but it begins to transfer itself into the modern world. Now, in the modern world, in the postmodern world, I suppose I should really say, we're dealing with a really different mindset. In the past, people dealt with death in a much more honest and straightforward way. Colonial houses in America had coffin doors in the kitchen. And what a coffin door was for was coffins. People would die. They would be put in the coffin. It would be brought into the house where they would have the wake. And then they would take it out through the house and have the funeral. People were dealing with death on a daily basis almost much more readily in the past. And as a result, people had an awareness of death and an honesty about death that we don't have. In our world, we hide the dying. They don't die at home anymore. They go to hospice. Their bodies are never returned to the home when they die in hospice or in the hospital or whatever. Their bodies are taken to professionals who prepare them. And if there's a viewing or something like that, it's held at the funeral home or at the church. And then it goes to the cemetery where, unlike in the past, you do not see the casket being lowered into the grave. We insulate ourselves from death because we don't really know what to do with it. We like to make believe it's not going to happen. Earlier vampires are always connected with death, and they're always, whether you're dealing with modernity versus tradition or whether you're dealing with wasting diseases or whatever, vampires were closely associated with death. Now, they're not in a very real sense. Okay, they talk about them dying and being undead and things like that. But in most cases, these days, vampires are presented as an escape in a lot of ways from the problem of death, because the vampire lives forever.
So are they a modern or a postmodern representation of immortality? Is the search for eternal life?
I think they're a postmodern representation of immortality. You talked, I believe, a moment ago about everlasting love or eternal love or something like that. Combine the eroticized romantic vampire with this idea that the vampire never dies, and suddenly you create this possibility of, eternal love.
Huh. So it's a fusion of concepts coming together in a new hybrid or hybridization. Huh?
And a lot of it really centers around this idea of ignoring, avoiding, or making believe death isn't real.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
I think that that's really critical to what's happening here. It's the modern vampires are recreated regularly. As a matter of fact, my talk on this is subtitled "The Evolution of a Monster." Vampires are recreated kind of regularly on the basis of the cultural environment in which the stories are created. So in our postmodern world, we don't think about vampires the way they did 100 or 200 years ago.
So how did you pivot, or how do you pivot to people who show perhaps a preoccupation with vampires and the fascination of that? Because obviously it takes them into the territory of life, death, eternal life, and which is gospel territory. How do you pivot to talking to someone who's preoccupied by that, but they're not interested in God?
Well, the first thing, most people who are interested in vampires in the stories and things like that most of them are just interested in the stories. They like to imagine. It's an imaginative exercise. Tolkien was once, people said that, when he creates the giant spiders in The Hobbit, it's because when he was a boy, he was afraid of spiders. And Tolkien's response was something to the effect of course I was afraid of spiders. We were all afraid of spiders because we liked being afraid of spiders.
Right.
They enjoyed it.
Especially big ones, right?
Yeah. It's kind of a singular thrill.
So his point was, this isn't some sort of Freudian thing going on.
Yeah.
People like being scared. That's why horror movies are so popular, so sort of perennially popular. As a sort of strange aside, the group Black Sabbath, that was started when Ozzy Osbourne and his friends were trying to put together a band, and they noticed that everybody was going to see a local horror movie. I think it actually was a vampire movie. And he looked at this and he said, "Oh, people like being scared. Let's go with that." And that's how Black Sabbath came about. But the thing that, so I think, like I said, people like vampires. They like the possibility of werewolves or spooks or ghouls or ghosts or whatever. They're sort of intrigued by this. I'm not sure how many of them actually believe it. But as I said, I started this course, Witches, Werewolves, and Vampires. What was in the back of my mind, what was in the forefront of my mind is, well, this should sell. I should be able to get enough students for this. But what was in the background is, the reason for doing this is it gives me a chance to start asking the students questions about the supernatural, about their own assumptions about the world, about the nature of good and evil, all of these kinds of things. And so when you find somebody who is into this kind of thing, those are the sorts of questions that you should start asking. And by the way, you want to ask questions. You don't want to give answers. Get them talking. Listen to what they say, ask follow-up questions, and so on. But use this as a way of drawing them out about what their real beliefs are.
Good.
It has been said that the coffin is an evangelist in the sense that a person goes to a funeral against their will and are forced against their will to be exposed to a reality that they've essentially been successful in averting or not thinking about. So that window of vulnerability and that finality of death is the very thing that people can seek to avoid. And then in the funeral, then this denial of death we've been talking about here in our own cultures. And so to find some kind of a way of perhaps romanticizing, getting away from that awful grim reality instead of asking these fundamental questions of life is a challenge.
Right. And I think one of the advantages of the current interest in supernatural or paranormal stuff is it allows us to begin asking those questions without needing to wait for a funeral.
Right, without waiting for a funeral. Good.
Yeah, and I like the gospel picture there. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. Well, Glenn, I think we'll have to end this conversation here, but what I would intrigued is I think this is the beginning of many more conversations. You've got a lot more curious interests and history that we want to hear more about. So I hope you'll be ready to come back and maybe talk about some other of the inhabitation of the monster world and such, so we can explore some reflections on truth, goodness, and beauty in this weird world in which we live today.
Before we cut off, I'd like to read you one more thing, because we talk about, most of this stuff is people's imagination, and they're sort of like, they kind of like the idea of a what if, those sorts of things. It turns out that that's not always the case. DJ Williams is an associate professor of social work at the University of Iowa, and Emily Pryor at the Center for Positive Sexuality in Los Angeles published a paper in Critical Social Work back in 2015 entitled, "Do We Always Practice What We Preach? Real Vampires' Fears of Coming Out of the Coffin to Social Workers and Helping Professionals." So there is actually a subculture of people who are trying to live like vampires. That's a whole nother topic we could talk about later.
Yeah, that's amazing.
We'll come back to that. Well, thank you, Glenn. This has been very rich.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate the time, my friend. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Boa.
An intriguing time for us to reflect on these bizarre changes in the culture that apprehend death in a totally different way now and try to romanticize and try to avert and avoid the actual implications that are there right in front of us. Yeah.
And we need to really engage with this history of these ideas and show how they keep transmuting across time, trying to give alternatives to the gospel as opposed to real answers to life.
That's right.
Well, thank you again.
God bless.
God bless you.